Well, James Corbett had put Ken Buechler, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, up on his site today. Big story. Ryan Dawson, at the end of his video, his sample video, up on his site, he had personally put in a notation that enenews is not a news site, and they certainly are a news site. They link out to all the professors, all the universities, all the institutions, both sides of the story, all the mainstream media, anybody that talks about any nuclear issues, not just Fukushima. And so it's a totally credible site. It's not like they're writing the stories, they're just linking you over to the original story. And when you put them together in context, in a single spot, it's a great site. And so for Ryan to do that, you got to realize Ryan is not a news site, okay? James Corbett is not a news site compared to enenews. They aggregate absolutely everything, both sides of the story, and they don't miss nothing.
They're exporting their trash to the radioactive or contaminated soil and trash to other prefectures where it's cut with regular trash, and then they burn it just to get around the small regulations they do have that say, well, you can't burn this stuff. But if you mix it with normal trash and spread it around enough, then you can burn it.
Exactly right, which gets back to the point of what are the different vectors by which this radiation can and is entering the ecosystem. And of course, one of them is through the incineration of waste products around the country here. But of course.
So enenews already beat you, Ryan, many times. 3 workers suffer cardiac arrest at Japanese incineration plant associated with cesium-137 exposure. You know why you never heard of that? Because you don't use enenews. They aggregate it all there. This is a Harvard study made 2007, talking about the injection height of the biomass burning emissions in the boreal forest regions. They go on in the study to say that 3 to 5 kilometers up is not unusual. This stuff came across the Pacific Ocean to America. This is a June 2004 ozone production in the Trans-Pacific Asian pollution plume. And they're talking about how pollution goes up to 5 to 8 kilometers in the air. This was from a Harvard study in 2004.
And I think it shows that there are many sources of radiation and radioactive disasters waiting to happen, really, that are local to North America that can be now conveniently covered over because people will only be looking at Fukushima as the only possible source of radioactivity, which is a pretty good cover, I think, for the nuclear industry in North America to basically cover over all their sins and to say, oh, look, it's all coming from the other side of the Pacific Ocean.
The NRC has held more than 150 public meetings to get input on our Fukushima work and share progress. We're also closely coordinating with other U.S. federal and state agencies regarding information about current concentrations of radioactive contamination in the Pacific Ocean. Based on the best scientific information available, no agency in the United States or abroad has identified any evidence of concerns for U.S. food and water supply or public health.
And to say, oh, look, it's all coming from the other side of the Pacific Ocean. But of course, I think most people who are listening to this conversation around the world probably aren't interested in all of this as it affects Japan generally. They're probably interested in how this affects them and the idea that there is this radioactive death cloud shrouding the planet that is going to fry us and incinerate us all in the next few years, which, again, is an idea that has taken on a lot of prominence in the alternative media in recent years.
On your left is China exports pollution to U.S., and on your right is a different study of another models that are showing latitudes and how you have trace, which is just from burning fuels, biomass, fires, and everything else like the incinerator fires, and how that pollution makes it across the Pacific Ocean and how it lingers over America for extended periods and adds to the contributing amount of pollution in their environment.
And everything in this scenario becomes further proof of the preordained conclusion that this radioactive death cloud is killing everything. And
prior to Fukushima, it was all HARP.
That was exactly right. Yeah. Exactly. There are these things that have these explanatory powers for people that simply by their very nature cannot be disproved because they explain everything.
I mean, this is all well documented. This one, it was 6 new episodes of Trans-Pacific transport of the air pollution across the Pacific, you have to pay a lot of money to read it. And so we do have the abstract that it was measured between 1993 and 2001. And it's just normal pollution will make it across the Pacific Ocean is all we're trying to show you here, that you don't need some cataclysmic event to make a trans-Pacific voyage. And so for you to come out and demonize everybody saying that the pollution makes it from Fukushima over to here, don't forget there's a jet stream up there.
And there doesn't have to be any exact. It's interesting because the more that there is information to debunk these claims.
So this was a Springer journal published peer review. It showed evidence for trans-Pacific air pollution comes from the three main sources: long-range transport of acidic and non-acidic contaminants into and across the Pacific Ocean from sources originating in the Pacific Rim countries and beyond trans-Pacific air pollution. You can buy this model from Science Direct for $35. The impact of trans-Pacific transport of mineral dust in the United States atmospheric environment. A global transport model was used to estimate the impact of trans-Pacific transport of mineral dust or aerosol concentrations in North America during 2001. But what it does is shows you all, what I'm showing you is all these studies of how pollution has been found crossing the Pacific Ocean and how it lingers over United States. And that's all enenews is really doing. It's just showing you all, the studies that are out there and the models, and you can go look at these yourself and pay $35 and use it to bludgeon people like Ryan and James, or just to, have a model that is accurate, that this stuff doesn't need nuclear detonations, it doesn't need the hurricanes to bring it over here. It just comes over normally. But we know that it came over here repeatedly, and so why is James and Ryan denying that it can come over here and denying that the jet streams exist when everybody knows the jet streams are real? Whether Ryan Dawson or James Corbett wants to believe it or not, they actually truly are real, folks.
For example, pointing out that the starfish wasting disease was first noted in 2008.
Yeah, the San Francisco Chronicle said Fukushima radiation possible culprit, not just any random person. And the radioactive fallout, what do you think it does? It rains out and then it washes down to the coastline. I was a commercial diver for 14 years. But they've been dumping depleted uranium into the ocean for a long time. Yes, there could be other causes for that die-out. But because of all the radioactive fallout, this is the U.S. model 137 cesium dispersal in 40 days. It's okay to assume that washed back into the ocean. And sea stars use salt water like you use blood, and so they would have been affected very quickly. If you ignore all the evidence, then when it happens, it's too late to do anything about it, right? If you look at the symptoms and treat it, or do you wait till you're dying of cancer before you even bother going to the hospital?
The more that type of evidence comes out, the stronger people seem to get in their conviction that any of that evidence is being presented by, obviously, government-paid shills or what have you. It seems to entrench people even further in their kind of their mentality that on the onset of this disaster, it was the fallout that was happening directly into the atmosphere that was being belched out into the atmosphere and then rained down. A lot of it happening in that section of Japan and around there, including over Tokyo, where there was something in Japan called the SPEEDI system, SPEEDI, which is an acronym that I can't ever remember what it stands for, but basically a system that's designed specifically to forecast fallout for nuclear emergencies. And the media was denied access to the SPEEDI data during the first few weeks of this crisis. And it was later pointed out, they eventually got this data months later, and it was pointed out that basically it showed that the forecast showed there would be radiation fallout over Tokyo, which presumably is exactly why the media was denied it, even though it is a publicly funded and supposedly publicly available scientific resource that was specifically designed specifically for these types of emergencies. So again, cover-ups have been ongoing, and even some of the latest cover-ups that now affect the Nuclear Regulatory Council in the United States. NBC News has just gotten hold of FOIA documents that prove that the NRC was deliberately misleading the public about what it knew about the Fukushima disaster. For example, a PR manager was writing in an email to his colleagues, while we know more than these say, we're sticking to this story for now, et cetera, et cetera. So we know there have been ongoing cover-ups, and we know that this has been going on since the very... So that's the kind of cover-up we're dealing with, and it is very serious, and it is an ongoing concern that is continuing to leak radioactive materials into the ocean. And this is a concern. But again, as you say, there's the other side of this coin, which is the alarmism that I think really does dilute some of the very real information about what's coming out from Fukushima and how it really affects people around the globe. And just a specific example I really did want to mention, because I think it's a good example of this, was that recent viral video that took place on a beach in, I believe, San Francisco, where someone was walking around the beach with their Geiger counter and basically getting a high CPM indicating, oh, well, there's a radioactive source around here. And of course, by the logic of the internet, well, this could only possibly be from Fukushima. That was quickly debunked by people who actually knew how to use these radiation instruments to read what kind of radiation it was, and it was not the type of radiation that had the signature of the radioactive materials that were coming from Fukushima. However, that does raise the question of where these high readings of radioactivity on the beach were coming from, because they were there, but it was not coming from the other side of the world where this Fukushima event was taking place.
Don't forget there's a jet stream up there.
Partly it was because of the sand on the beach itself.
A new computer simulation shows how radioactivity is spread around the world from the disabled Fukushima Daiichi plant. The simulation was created by a group of researchers at the University of Tokyo and Kyushu University and released on Wednesday. The simulation is based on the scenario in which contaminated air was vented from the disabled number 2 reactor building on March 14th, 3 days after the massive earthquake and tsunami. Computer images show the radioactive material was lifted 5,000 meters into the air. It was then carried by westerly winds and spread over the Pacific Ocean. The images indicate that on the 4th day after being vented, the substances reached the west coast of the United States, and on the 7th day, they approached Iceland after crossing the Atlantic. The simulation is based on the scenario in which contaminated air was vented from the disabled number 2 reactor building on March 14th, 3 days after the massive earthquake and tsunami.
But it was not coming from the other side of the world where this Fukushima event was taking place. Partly it was because of the sand on the beach itself, but I think it also goes to show that there are all sorts of radiation sources that are local, for example, to the United States, that make certain areas of the United States much more radioactive than certain parts of Japan, which is...
They set off plenty of test bombs in their own deserts.
This is exactly part of the point. Certainly there was the decades of open air nuclear testing, which has left an identifiable trace of, for example, cesium in the radioactive cesium in the ocean, which is still
nuclear waste into Indian reservations.
And
James, haven't you seen the meme on Facebook with the yellow scribbles all over the ocean? That proves it.
Yeah, well, if you're referring to the chart that gets thrown around, that's the NOAA chart of the wave heights from the tsunami itself, which was thrown around and used as an example of presumably, I guess the idea was that this was supposed to show the spread of the radiation from the disaster, which looked very menacing indeed if people took it that way. But of course, that's not what it was about. It was about wave heights. So yes, I mean, that's just one symptom of a kind of a greater disease that I think has swept around the globe, which is hysteria and hype surrounding the radioactive release, which is not something that I think is not a concern of any sort. But I think that what this has shown is that the public's understanding of radiation, how it works, what the dangers are, what kinds of elements are dangerous and in what way they are dangerous, how they're likely to enter any given ecosystem, how we can test for them, et cetera, et cetera. It has really shown the public's massive ignorance on these issues, and it's been really an eye opener for me because
Beyond ignorance, false confidence, because they don't know that they
Yes.
don't know. They think they do know when they don't know. And the other dangerous part is the more the alarmists go around saying these things and they get dismissed and debunked, you have this possibility of sort of the baby out with the bathwater. So people hear that enough times and dismiss it, but then when there is an actual problem, they just group that in and go, oh, that's nothing, they always lie. And they shouldn't be doing that.
Well, that's exactly right, because there are real risks to this, but I think you're right. When there is that boy that cried wolf scenario where for example, I'm sure you saw that story that creeped up in December where there was some footage. The TEPCO has live feeds of what's happening at the plant, and there was some footage of some wafts of steam that came from reactor 3.
They do that all year.
Exactly. This was the part of the story that didn't get picked up on. It had been doing that. I believe the first one was picked up in June or something like that. So this was nothing new, but it was new, I guess, to whoever decided to report on this. Which the main outlet that I saw as the originator of this story about the radioactive steam that was going to engulf the United States was actually an outfit that I won't name by name to avoid giving them any undue attention. And again, we can actually measure the radioactive plume in the ocean. It can be measured. Now, here's another interesting point. It is not being measured. There is not a single federal agency in the United States that is measuring the waters off the Pacific coast, and that is a cause for concern. So, of course, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, which I believe is based in Maine, has taken upon itself the idea of crowdsourcing and crowdfunding the effort to actually test some of this water, and they've started doing so and have released some of their preliminary results. But they're actually going through this. I think it's called ourradioactiveocean.org. I'm going to say that's yes, ourradioactiveocean.org is the website that people can go to, and they can help crowdfund that effort if they are actually interested in the real radiation readings that can be done. The early readings have shown that that there is, in fact, at this point, not the main part of the radioactive plume certainly has not reached the west coast of the United States yet. It is due to really start arriving this year, which again means how could this viral video that was taking place in San Francisco months ago, how could this have been an example of a radioactive plume that has not reached the shores of North America yet, unless of course it was that radioactive fallout in the atmosphere that stopped almost 2.5 years ago now. So again, it just goes to expose all sorts of weak points in people's understanding. But I think the interesting part of this is, again, the more people have basically bought onto the narrative that this is the extinction level event, we are all going to die, the more they hear evidence to the contrary, the further entrenched in their position they become, and the less they want to hear it. So that any good news, any news that any sane person would say, well, that's a good thing. Oh, you mean the radioactive plume hasn't even arrived really at the North America yet? Well, that's a good thing. Most people would actually be relieved to hear something like that. But there are a lot of people out there that get angry because clearly this is part of the cover-up. So so it just creates this feedback loop where the only news sources people will listen to are the ones that say the most outrageous things, really, and the ones that will confirm their bias that that basically the end is nigh and we're all going to die.
Well, fear sells. How many times have you gotten an email, a personal email saying, get out of there, save yourself?
On pretty much a weekly basis at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's the same old, same old. But talking about the water, where you're saying it's leaking or they're actually purposely putting some of the radioactive water into the ocean. Is that going to affect the fish? People, I'm playing devil's advocate. Isn't that going to poison the ocean if they're doing that on purpose? I mean, it's radioactive, or how diluted is it per day?
Well, actually, it does have a noticeable and a detectable impact on the fish, for example, in the Fukushima Bay region. And this is something that is obviously being monitored here in Japan. And there have been throughout this disaster, there have been times at which they have the Japanese government has declared it perfectly safe. Oh, all the seafood's okay. Fukushima fish went back into the Tokyo markets, etc. And then they found, I believe it was in August or September of last year, they found another fish with record levels of radiation that that again shows that their monitoring is haphazard at best. And that's in fact exactly why myself and my family here are being extremely selective about seafood that we eat. Basically, unless we know where it's coming from, we're not going to eat it. And that's just one of the precautions that we take here. And I think that's sensible, because the real danger, I think, at this point,
Well, it is a lot easier to buy local in Japan.
it is, and I do appreciate that there is a lot of detailed labeling here about specifically what prefectures, produce, etc., are coming from. The question being whether how much you want to trust that, and how much you can trust some of the labeling that goes on here, given some of the food scandals we've seen in recent years in this country.
I'm in Nard. I get it right off the farm. So
yes, exactly, and there is a very good kind of local farming infrastructure here. Most families here in Japan have their own farm and will actually pick fresh produce on a regular basis. So it is a good culture in that sense, and I do really appreciate that. We also use something here called Green Co-op, which is basically just a cooperative that sources organic, in fact, non-GMO and ingredients for all of their products. And in fact, they do radiation testing, and they post the results of that. So that's another way that we are keeping track of what we're ingesting, because this is really one of the main concerns, I think, for people in Japan, is the actual ingestion of this. This is the way it's getting into the ecosystem and into the food chain, is through the radiation that's leaking out into the ocean. And of course, in the early stages of this disaster, when the fallout was still fresh, obviously in the spring and summer of 2011. It was the leafy vegetables that you had to be concerned about, and then the root vegetables after that were sucking up the radioactive fallout. Obviously, again, my wife and I were avoiding anything that came from that part of Japan, as just our precaution against that. And this is still an ongoing concern, because, of course, with Chernobyl, that was the key intake of the iodine 131 that was part of the radioactive fallout from the Chernobyl disaster. It was getting into the milk supply, which then got into children, and there was a lot of cases of thyroid cancer as a result of that. And depending which statistics you'll read and who you'll listen to, it was either as few as 9 people and as many as 1 million people that died as a result of that fallout in Chernobyl. So there's considerable debate, although, yeah, that's maybe a whole other thing to think about.
So if they're going to put out 40-odd minute videos, and they're not going to bring in the other stuff for context, they're just going to use the stuff that we've been beat up with over and over and over for 3 years, then what's going on here? We're forced to come out and call them out publicly. We just can't sit back and let them get away with it anymore. Nothing will change. Nothing will ever change.
The situation may be worse than thought. Studies from last year indicate that radioactive water will contaminate the entire Pacific Ocean in just 6 years. Kim Min-ji reports.
This graphic shows the gradual contamination of the Pacific Ocean due to leaks of radioactive water from the crippled Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan. The simulation, which was run by a German marine research institute, shows the entire Pacific waters being polluted by radioactive water in just 6 years.